Pierre Laval was a French politician. During the time of the Third Republic, he served as Prime Minister of France from the 27th of January 1931 to the 20th of February 1932, and also headed another government from the 7th of June 1935 to the 24th of January 1936. Laval began his career as a socialist, but over time drifted far to the right. Following France's surrender and armistice with Germany in 1940, he served in the Vichy Regime. He took a prominent role under Philippe Pétain, first as the vice president of Vichy's Council of Ministers from the 11th of July 1940 to the 13th of December 1940, and later as the head of government from the 18th of April 1942 to the 20th of August 1944. After the liberation of France in 1944, Laval was arrested by the French government under General Charles de Gaulle. In what some historians consider a flawed trial, Laval was found guilty of high treason, and after a thwarted suicide attempt, he was executed by firing squad. His manifold political activities have left a complicated and controversial legacy, and there are more than a dozen biographies of him. Early life. Laval was born the 28th of June 1883 at Châteldon, Puy-de-Dôme, in the northern part of Auvergne. His father worked in the village as a café proprietor, butcher and postman. He also owned a vineyard and horses. Laval was educated at the village school in Châteldon. At age 15, he was sent to a Paris lycée to study for his baccalaureate. Returning south to Lyon, he spent the next year reading for a degree in zoology. Laval joined the Socialists in 1903, when he was living in Saint-Étienne, 62 kilometers southwest of Lyon. "I was never a very orthodox socialist," he said in 1945, "by which I mean that I was never much of a Marxist. My socialism was much more a socialism of the heart than a doctrinal socialism. I was much more interested in men, their jobs, their misfortunes and their conflicts than in the digressions of the great German pontiff." Laval returned to Paris in 1907 at the age of 24. He was called up for military service and, after serving in the ranks, was discharged for varicose veins. In April 1913 he said, "Barrack-based armies are incapable of the slightest effort, because they are badly trained and, above all, badly commanded." Quote, he favored abolition of the army and replacement by a citizens' militia. During this period, Laval became familiar with the left-wing doctrines of Georges Sorel and Hubert Lagardelle. In 1909, he turned to the law, marriage and family. Shortly after becoming a member of the Paris Bar, he married the daughter of a Dr. Joseph Clausat and set up a home in Paris with his new wife. Their only child, a daughter, was born in 1911. Although Laval's wife came from a political family, she never participated in politics. Laval was generally considered to be devoted to his family. Before the war, the years before the First World War were characterized by labor unrest, and Laval defended strikers, trade unionists, and left-wing agitators against government attempts to prosecute them. At a trade union conference, Laval said, "I am a comrade among comrades, a worker among workers. I am not one of those lawyers who are mindful of the bourgeois origin even when attempting to deny it. I am not one of those highbrow attorneys who engage in academic controversies and pose as intellectuals. I am proud to be what I am, a lawyer in the service of manual laborers who are my comrades, a worker like them. I am the brother. Comrades, I am a manual lawyer." During the First World War, Socialist deputy for the Seine. In April 1914, as fear of war swept the nation, the socialists and radicals geared up their electoral campaign in defense of peace. The leaders were Jean Jaurès and Joseph Caillaux. The Bloc des Gauches denounced the law passed in July 1913 extending compulsory military service from 2 to 3 years. The Confédération Générale du Travail trade union sought Laval as socialist candidate for the Seine, the district comprising Paris and its suburbs. He won. The Radicals, with the support of socialists, held the majority in the French Chamber of Deputies. Together they hoped to avert war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria on 28 June 1914 and of Jar Urs on 31 July 1914 shattered those hopes. Laval's brother, Jean, died in the first months of the war. Laval and 2,000 others were listed by the military in the Carnet, a compilation of potentially subversive elements who might hinder mobilization. In the name of national unity, Minister of the Interior Jean-Louis Malvy, despite pressure from chiefs of staff, refused to have anyone apprehended. Laval remained true to his pacifist convictions during the war. In December 1915, Jean Longuet, grandson of Karl Marx, proposed to socialist parliamentarians that they communicate with socialists of other states, hoping to press governments into a negotiated peace. Laval signed on, but the motion was defeated. With France's resources geared for war, goods were scarce or overpriced. On 30 January 1917, in the National Assembly, Laval called upon the Supply Minister Edouard Herriot to deal with the inadequate coal supply in Paris. When Herriot said, "If I could, I would unload the barges myself," Laval retorted, "Do not add ridicule to ineptitude." The words delighted the Assembly and attracted the attention of Georges Clemenceau, but left the relationship between Laval and Herriot permanently strained. Stockholm, the Polar Star. Laval scorned the conduct of the war and the poor supply of troops in the field. When mutinies broke out after General Robert Nivel's offensive of April 1917 at Chemin des Dames, he spoke in defense of the mutineers. When Marcel Cachin and Marius Moutet returned from St. Petersburg in June 1917 with the invitation to a socialist convention in Stockholm, Laval saw a chance for peace. In an address to the Assembly, he urged the chamber to allow a delegation to go, yes, Stockholm, in response to the call of the Russian Revolution. Yes, Stockholm, for peace. Yes, Stockholm, the Polar Star. The request was denied. The hope of peace in spring 1917 was overwhelmed by discovery of traitors, some real, some imagined, as with Malvy. Because he had refused to arrest Frenchmen on the Carnet, Malvy became a suspect. Laval's Stockholm Étoile Polaire speech had not been forgotten. Many of Laval's acquaintances, the publishers of the anarchist Bonnet Rouge, and other pacifists were arrested or interrogated. Though Laval frequented pacifist circles, it was said that he was acquainted with Leon Trotsky. The authorities did not pursue him. His status as a deputy, his caution, and his friendships protected him. In November 1917, Clemenceau offered him a post in government, but the Socialist Party had by then refused to enter any government. Laval toed the party line, but he questioned the wisdom of such a policy in a meeting of the Socialist members of Parliament. Initial post-war career. From socialist to independent in 1919, a conservative wave swept the Bloc National into control. Laval was not re-elected. The Socialists' record of pacifism, their opposition to Clemenceau, and anxiety arising from the excesses of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia contributed to the defeat. The General Confederation of Labour, with 2,400,000 members, launched a general strike in 1920, which petered out as thousands of workers were laid off. In response, the government sought to dissolve the CGT. Laval, with Joseph-Paul Boncoeur as chief counsel, defended the union's leaders, saving the union by appealing to the ministers Theodore Stieg and August Isaac. Laval's relations with the Socialist Party drew to an end. The last years with the Socialist caucus in the chamber combined with the party's disciplinary policies eroded Laval's attachment to the cause. With the Bolshevik victory in Russia, the party was changing. At the Congress of Tours in December 1920, the Socialists split into two ideological components: the French Communist Party, inspired by Moscow, and the more moderate French section of the Workers' International. Laval let his membership lapse, not taking sides as the two factions battled over the legacy of Jean Jaurès, mayor of Aubervilliers. In 1923, Aubervilliers in northern Paris needed a mayor. As a former deputy of the constituency, Laval was an obvious candidate. To be eligible for election, Laval bought farmland, Les Bourgeries. Few were aware of his defection from the Socialists. Laval was also asked by the local SFIO and Communist Party to head the lists. Laval chose to run under his own list of former Socialists he convinced to leave the party and work for him. This was an independent socialist party of sorts that existed only in Aubervilliers. In a four-way race, Laval won in the second round. He served as mayor of Aubervilliers until just before his death. Laval won over those he defeated by cultivating personal contacts. He developed a network among the humble and the well-to-do in Aubervilliers, and with mayors of neighboring towns. He was the only independent politician in the suburb. He avoided entering the ideological war between socialists and communists. Independent deputy for the Seine. In the 1924 legislative elections, the SFIO and the Radicals formed a national coalition known as the Cartel des Gauches. Laval headed a list of independent socialists in the Seine. The cartel won and Laval regained a seat in the National Assembly. His first act was to bring back Joseph Caillaux, former Prime Minister, cabinet member and member of the National Assembly and once the star of the Radical Party. Clemenceau had Caillaux arrested toward the end of the war for collusion with the enemy. He spent 2 years in prison and lost his civic rights. Laval stood for Cailloux's pardon and won. Caillaux became an influential patron. As a member of the government, minister and senator, Laval's reward for support of the cartel was appointment as Minister of Public Works in the government of Paul Painlevé in April 1925. 6 months later, the government collapsed. Laval from then on belonged to the club of former ministers from which new ministers were drawn. Between 1925 and 1926, Laval participated 3 more times in governments of Aristide Briand, once as Undersecretary to the Premier and twice as Minister of Justice. When he first became Minister of Justice, Laval abandoned his law practice to avoid conflict of interest. Laval's momentum was frozen after 1926 through a reshuffling of the cartel majority orchestrated by the radical socialist mayor and deputy of Lyon, Edouard Herriot. Founded in 1901, the Radical Party became the hinge faction of the Third Republic. Its supported defection often meant survival or collapse of governments. Through this latest swing, Laval was excluded from the direction of France for 4 years. Author Gaston Jacquemin suggested that Laval chose not to partake in a Herriot government, which he judged incapable of handling the financial crisis. 1926 marked the definitive break between Laval and the left, but he maintained friends on the left. In 1927 Laval was elected senator for the Seine, withdrawing from and placing himself above the political battles for majorities in the National Assembly. He longed for a constitutional reform to strengthen the executive branch and eliminate political instability, the flaw of the Third Republic. On the 2nd of March 1930 Laval returned as Minister of Labour in the second Tardieu government. Tardieu and Laval knew each other from the days of Clemenceau, which developed into mutual appreciation. Tardieu needed men he could trust. His previous government had collapsed a little over a week earlier because of the defection of the Minister of Labour, Louis Lucha. But, when the radical socialist Camille Chautemps failed to form a viable government, Tardieu was called back. Personal investments. From 1927 to 1930, Laval began to accumulate a sizable personal fortune. After the war, his wealth resulted in charges that he had used his political position to line his own pockets. "I have always thought," he wrote to the examining magistrate on the 11th of September 1945, "that a soundly based material independence, if not indispensable, gives those statesmen who possess it a much greater political independence." Until 1927 his principal source of income had been his fees as a lawyer, and in that year they totaled 113,350 francs, according to his income tax returns. Between August 1927 and June 1930, he undertook large-scale investments in various enterprises, totaling 51 million francs. Not all this money was his own. It came from a group of financiers who had the backing of an investment trust, the Union Syndicale Financière, and two banks, the Comptoir Lyon Allemand and the Banque Nationale de Crédit. Two of the investments which Laval and his backers acquired were provincial newspapers, Le Moniteur du Puy-de-Dôme and its associated printing works at Clermont-Ferrand, and a Lyon Républicain. The circulation of the Moniteur stood at 27,000 in 1926 before Laval took it over. By 1933, it had more than doubled to 58,250. Thereafter, circulation declined and never surpassed this peak. Profits varied, but during the 17 years of his control, Laval earned some 39 million francs in income from the paper and the printing works combined. The renewed plant was valued at 50 million francs, which led the High Court expert in 1945 to say with some justification that it had been an excellent deal for him. Minister of Labour and Social Insurance. More than 150,000 textile workers were on strike, and violence was feared. As Minister of Public Works in 1925, Laval had ended the strike of mine workers. Tardieu hoped he could do the same as Minister of Labour. The conflict was settled without bloodshed. Socialist politician Elie Couteau en Blum, never one of Laval's allies, conceded that Laval's intervention was skillful, opportune and decisive. Social insurance had been on the agenda for 10 years. It had passed the Chamber of Deputies, but not the Senate, in 1928. Tardieu gave Laval until May Day to get the project through. The date was chosen to stifle the agitation of Labor Day. Laval's first effort went into clarifying the muddled collection of texts. He then consulted employer and labor organizations. Laval had to reconcile the divergent views of Chamber and Senate. Had it not been for Laval's unwearying patience, Laval's associate Tissier wrote, an agreement would never have been achieved. In 2 months Laval presented the Assembly a text which overcame its original failure. It met the financial constraints, reduced the control of the government, and preserved the choice of doctors and the billing freedom. The Chamber and the Senate passed the law with an overwhelming majority. When the bill had passed its final stages, Tardieu described his Minister of Labour as displaying at every moment of the discussion as much tenacity as restraint and ingenuity. First, Laval government. Tardieu's government ultimately proved unable to weather the Austric affair. After the failure of the Austric Bank, it appeared that members of the government had improper ties to it. The scandal involved Minister of Justice Raoul Perret and Under-Secretaries Henry Falcoz and Eugene Lautier. Though Tardieu was not involved, on the 4th of December 1930, he lost his majority in the Senate. President Gaston Doumergue called on Louis Barthou to form a government, but Barthou failed. Doumergue turned to Laval, who fared no better. The following month the government formed by Théodore Stieg floundered. Doumergue renewed his offer to Laval. On the 27th of January 1931 Laval successfully formed his first government. In the words of Elie Couteau and Blum, the socialist opposition was amazed and disappointed that the ghost of Tardieu's government reappeared within a few weeks of being defeated, with Laval at its head. Like a nightbird surprised by the light, Laval's nomination as premier led to speculation that Tardieu, the new agriculture minister, held the real power in the Laval government. Although Laval thought highly of Tardieu and Briand, and applied policies in line with theirs, Laval was not Tardieu's mouthpiece. Ministers who formed the Laval government were in great part those who had formed Tardieu governments, but that was a function of the composite majority Laval could find at the National Assembly. Raymond Poincaré, Aristide Briand and Tardieu before him had offered ministerial posts to Hériot's radicals, but to no avail. Besides Briand, André Maginot, Pierre-Étienne Flandin, Paul Reynaud, Laval brought in as his advisers friends such as Maurice Foulon from Aubervilliers, and Pierre Cathala, whom he knew from his days in Bayonne and who had worked in Laval's Labour Ministry. Cathala began as Under-Secretary of the Interior and was appointed as Minister of the Interior in January 1932. Blaise Diagne of Senegal, the first African deputy, had been elected to the National Assembly at the same time as Laval in 1914. Laval invited Diagne to join his cabinet as Under-Secretary to the colonies. He was the first black African appointed to a cabinet position in a French government. Laval also called on financial experts such as Jacques Rouff, Charles Rist and Adeodat Bassard. André-François Poncet was appointed as Under-Secretary to the Premier and then as Ambassador to Germany. Laval's government included an economist, Claude-Joseph Guignot, when economists in government service were rare. France in 1931 was unaffected by the world economic crisis. Laval declared on embarking for the United States on the 16th of October 1931. France remained healthy thanks to work and savings. Agriculture, small industry, and protectionism were the bases of France's economy, with a conservative policy of contained wages and limited social services. France had accumulated the largest gold reserves in the world after the United States. France reaped the benefit of devaluation of the franc orchestrated by Poincaré, which made French products competitive on the world market. In the whole of France, 12,000 people were recorded as unemployed. Laval and his cabinet considered the economy and gold reserves as means to diplomatic ends. Laval left to visit London, Berlin and Washington. He attended conferences on the world crisis, war reparations and debt disarmament, and the gold standard. Role in 1931 Austrian financial crisis. In 1931, Austria underwent a banking crisis when its largest bank, the Creditans-Tal, was revealed to be nearly bankrupt, threatening a worldwide financial crisis. World leaders began negotiating the terms for an international loan to Austria's central government to sustain its financial system. However, Laval blocked the proposed package for nationalistic reasons. He demanded that France receive a series of diplomatic concessions in exchange for its support, including renunciation of a prospective German-Austrian customs union. This proved to be fatal for the negotiations, which ultimately fell through. As a result, the Creditans-Tal declared bankruptcy on the 11th of May 1931, precipitating a crisis that quickly spread to other nations. Within 4 days, bank runs in Budapest were underway, and the bank failures began spreading to Germany and Britain, among others. Hoover Moratorium. The Hoover Moratorium of 1931, a proposal made by American President Herbert Hoover to freeze all intergovernmental debt for a 1-year period, was, according to author and political advisor McGeorge Bundy, the most significant action taken by an American president for Europe since Woodrow Wilson's administration. The United States had enormous stakes in Germany. Long-term German borrowers owed the United States private sector more than $1.25 billion. The short-term debt neared $1 billion. By comparison, the entire United States national income in 1931 was just $54 billion. To put it into perspective, authors Walter Lippmann and William O. Scroggs stated in the United States in World Affairs, an account of American foreign relations, that the American stake in Germany's government and private obligations was equal to half that of all the rest of the world combined. The proposed moratorium would also benefit Great Britain's investment in Germany's private sector, making more likely the repayment of those loans while the public indebtedness was frozen. It was in Hoover's interest to offer aid to an ailing British economy in the light of the indebtedness of Great Britain to the United States. France, on the other hand, had a relatively small stake in Germany's private debt but a huge interest in German reparations, and payment to France would be compromised under Hoover's moratorium. The scheme was further complicated by ill-timing, perceived collusion among the US, Great Britain and Germany, and the fact that it constituted a breach of the Young Plan. Such breach could only be approved in France by the National Assembly. The survival of the Laval government rested on the legislative body's approval of the moratorium. 17 days elapsed between the proposal and the vote of confidence of the French legislators. The delay was blamed for the lack of success of the Hoover moratorium. The U.S. Congress did not approve it until December 1931. In support of the Hoover moratorium, Laval undertook a year of personal and direct diplomacy by which he traveled to London, Berlin and the United States. While he wore considerable domestic achievements to his name, his international efforts were short on results. British Premier Ramsay MacDonald and Foreign Secretary Arthur Anderson, preoccupied by internal political divisions and the collapse of the pound sterling, were unable to help. German Chancellor Heinrich Brüning and Foreign Minister Julius Curtius, both eager for Franco-German reconciliation, were under siege on all sides. They faced a very weak economy which made meeting government payroll a weekly miracle. Private bankruptcies and constant layoffs had the communists on a short fuse. On the other end of the political spectrum, the German army was spying on the Brüning cabinet and feeding information to the Stahlhelm, Bund der Frontsoldaten and the National Socialists, effectively freezing any overtures towards France. In the United States, the conference between Hoover and Laval was an exercise in mutual frustration. Hoover's plan for a reduced military had been rebuffed, albeit gently. A solution to the Danzig corridor had been retracted. The concept of introducing silver standard for the countries that went off the gold standard was disregarded as a frivolous proposal by Laval and Albert Busson. Hoover thought it might have helped Mexico, India, China and South America, but Laval dismissed the silver solution as an inflationary proposition, adding that it was cheaper to inflate paper. Laval did not get a security pact, without which the French would never consider disarmament, nor did he obtain an endorsement for the political moratorium. The promise to match any reduction of German reparations with a decrease of the French debt was not put in the communiqué. The joint statement declared the attachment of France and the United States to the gold standard. The two governments also agreed that the Banque de France and the Federal Reserve would consult each other before transfers of gold. This was welcome news after the run on American gold in the preceding weeks. In light of the financial crisis, the leaders agreed to review the economic situation in Germany before the Hoover Moratorium had run its course. These were meager political results. The Hoover-Laval encounter, however, had other effects. It made Laval more widely known and raised his standing in the United States and France. The American and French press were smitten. His optimism was such a contrast to his grim-sounding international contemporaries that in Time magazine named him as the 1931 Man of the Year, an honor never bestowed before on a Frenchman. He followed Mohandas Gandhi and preceded Franklin D. Roosevelt in receiving the honor.